A porcelain teacup shattered against the dining room wall. Nobody flinched. Not the wealthy suitor seated at the table. Not the servants standing with their eyes fixed on the floor. Not even Victoria. Ashworth. Charlotte stood in the doorway and watched her mother laugh, not because anything was funny. Because there was a man at the table with money, and money required laughing. She had been standing there for nearly 3 minutes. Edward Ashford had not looked at her once. He had looked at the sideboard. He had looked at the fireplace. He had looked at the framed inventory of the estate's acreage that her mother had hung in the dining room, specifically so that suitors could look at it. He had reviewed the terms of the Beaumont family debts with the same expression a butcher uses when inspecting livestock. He had not looked at Charlotte because he didn't need to. She was already accounted for. She was wearing the dress her mother had chosen for the evening, deep emerald silk, gold trim along the neckline, and pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. The Peary train. Everything about her appearance had been arranged to communicate one message to the man at the table. She was valuable. She was available. She was for sale. Charlotte turned away before either of them noticed her. She walked down the corridor alone, past the portraits of her ancestors, past the cracked plaster her mother refused to repair because spending money on walls didn't impress suitors. She stopped at the window at the far end of the hall and pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. Outside, the dark Scottish hills were barely visible in the mist. Her father had loved those hills. He used to take her walking along the ridgeline on Sunday mornings, pointing out landmarks, telling her the names of the peaks. He never once spoke to her about debts or duty or what she owed to the family name. He had been dead for 2 years, and in 2 years, this house had transformed from a home into a transaction. From behind the dining room doors came the sound of her mother laughing again. Charlotte pressed harder against the glass. She could feel the shape of her own future pressing back. Dinner after dinner, suitor after suitor, until eventually her mother found a man wealthy enough to cover the debts and desperate enough to accept a bride he hadn't truly chosen. She would become a signature on a contract, a solution to an arithmetic problem, a name written into someone else's ledger, unless she did something about it. The thought arrived quietly, the way dangerous thoughts often do. What if she made herself worthless? Not worthless to herself. She knew her own value, but worthless to her mother's plans, worthless to the men who circled this house, like investors reviewing an asset. What if she married someone so completely unsuitable, so entirely outside the world her mother controlled, that no rescue could follow? What if she married a beggar? The idea should have horrified her. Every lesson she had ever received about propriety and reputation and the obligations of a noble family said this was unthinkable. But standing at that window, listening to her mother sell her future one dinner at a time, Charlotte Beaumont did not feel horrified. She felt free. By sunrise, she had made her decision. She would leave Ravenshire Manor. She would find a man with nothing, and she would marry him before her mother could stop her. What Charlotte could not have known, could not have imagined in even her most elaborate plans, was that the beggar she chose owned more land than every suitor her mother had ever invited to dinner combined. But that revelation was still weeks away. For now, there was only the decision, and a young woman walking away from everything she had ever known toward a future she was choosing entirely for herself. Hello and welcome to today's story. Before we go any further, I have a question for you, and I genuinely want to know your answer. If the person you loved turned out to be hiding an enormous secret about who they really were, would you stay or would you walk away? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Stay or walk away and tell me why. I read every single one. If this is your first time here and you enjoy long-form stories like this one, stories about courage, hidden identity, and love that nobody planned for, please subscribe and leave a like before this video ends. It takes 2 seconds and it helps this channel more than you know. Now, back to Charlotte and the decision that was about to change everything. Chapter 1. The Daughter for Sale. The morning after her decision, Charlotte rose before the house stirred. She dressed without ringing for the maid. She moved quietly through her own bedroom, pulling on practical clothes rather than the silk and lace her mother preferred. She opened the drawer of her writing desk and counted the money she'd been setting aside for months. Small amounts, quietly redirected from household accounts she managed, while her mother focused on entertaining. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. She sat at the desk for a moment and thought about Edward Ashford. She had researched him the way she researched everything. Quietly, thoroughly, without anyone knowing she was doing it. She had spoken, who had a sister with the cookie in Edinburgh, who knew the Ashford household staff. What she learned was not reassuring. Edward Ashford had already been married once. His first wife had died young, worn down by a combination of his indifference and his habit of spending her dowry on ventures that required him to be elsewhere. He wanted a second wife for the same reason he had wanted the first. Not for companionship, for capital. And Victoria Ashworth thought he was a fine prospect. Charlotte understood her mother was not a cruel woman. She was a frightened one. The debts were real. The creditors were real. The threat of losing Ravenshire Manor was real. Victoria had watched her husband mismanage the estate for years, had stayed silent because staying silent was what a wife was expected to do. And now she was the one standing in the wreckage. Charlotte understood all of that. It did not change what she was about to do. She folded the writings since 2 in the morning, sealed it, and set it on the desk, where it would be found after she was gone. She addressed it simply, "Mother." Inside she had written very little. Only that she was well, only that she had made a choice, only that she would write again when she was settled. She did not explain the choice. There was no explanation that would have made sense inside this house. She picked up her traveling bag and walked to the door. In the hallways, she passed Amelia Fairchild, who was already up and carrying a lamp toward the kitchen. Amelia was the housekeeper's daughter, and 2 years younger than Charlotte, and the closest thing to a true friend Charlotte that Ravenshire Manor had ever produced. She stopped when she saw Charlotte's bag. The two women looked at each other for a long moment. "You're leaving," Amelia said. It was not a question. Yes. "Does your mother know?" "She will, soon enough." Amelia set the lamp down on the side table and studied Charlotte with the kind of careful, searching attention that only very old friendships permit. The look that sees past what you're doing to why you're doing it. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pressed something into Charlotte's hand. A small coin purse, heavier than it looked. "My savings," Amelia said simply. "Don't argue with me." Charlotte opened her mouth. Amelia shook her head. "Your father always said you carried more strength than the rest of this house combined. Go prove him right." Charlotte closed her fingers around the purse. She could not find words adequate to what she felt in that moment. She held Amelia's gaze for one more second, long enough to say what she couldn't say, and then turned and walked toward the back entrance of the manor. The door opened onto the cold gray morning. Charlotte walked toward the hills without looking back. She took a hired coach to the nearest railway station, then traveled north by train for several hours. She did not read. She sat at the window and watched the countryside change, the towns growing smaller the hills growing wilder, the sky opening up in ways that the sky over Ravenshire Manor never quite did. Each mile made Ravenshire feel farther away. She had spent so long inside that house's version of her future that she had almost forgotten a different one was possible. She left the train at a small station and asked the station master about villages in the area. He mentioned several. One of them was called Glenhaven. Quiet place, he said. Old families, not many strangers passing through. That sounded precisely right. She hired a cart and traveled the remaining distance on roads that grew narrower and steeper as the afternoon wore on. By the time Glenhaven came into view, a cluster of stone buildings gathered at the bottom of a wide valley, smoke rising from chimneys, a gray stone church at its center. The sun was already dropping toward the hills. She arranged a room at the village inn. She washed, she ate, she slept, and in the morning she went out to find herself a beggar. What she found instead was considerably more complicated. Chapter 2. The man who walked away from everything. She had expected it to be easy. Glenhaven was a small village, and Charlotte had assumed that a place this remote, this removed, from the prosperity of Edinburgh and London, would have its share of men living in genuine poverty. She had imagined something simple. A man with no prospects, no connections, no particular understanding of what she was proposing. A transaction that required no explanation and produced no complications. What she had not anticipated was Arthur Blackwood. She noticed him on her second morning in the village. He was working in the yard beside the blacksmith's shop, repairing a fence that had collapsed in the last storm. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing clothes that had seen better decades. His hair was dark and slightly too long, as though he cut it himself and didn't particularly care whether it was even. There was mud on his boots and a long-heeled scar along his jaw that she noticed when he turned his head. He looked, by every visible measure, like a man with nothing. She watched him from across the street. He was working efficiently and without apparent frustration. The broken fence was a straightforward problem, and he was solving it with the calm precision of someone who had repaired many things in his life and found the work satisfying rather than demeaning. An elderly woman came out of the cottage beside the yard and said something to him. He straightened, listened, nodded, and followed her inside. He was in there for perhaps 10 minutes. When he came back out, he returned to the fence without any visible change in his expression. Charlotte approached. "Excuse me," she said. He looked up. His eyes were gray. The particular gray of a Scottish loch in October, neither warm nor cold, simply present. He registered her appearance in a single glance. The accent, the clothes, the quality of her traveling coat, and something in his expression became slightly more careful. "You're not from here," he said. "No, I arrived yesterday." "Looking for something?" Charlotte had practiced this question during the walk from the inn. She had rehearsed various approaches. Indirect, gradual, building toward the point. Standing in front of this particular man, she abandoned all of them. "I'm looking for a husband," she said. "Someone unsuitable. I want to marry someone my mother would consider entirely unacceptable." A pause. "And you're asking me? You look as though you fit the requirements." He set down the post he was holding and turned to face her more directly. The careful expression had not left his face, but something else had joined it. A quality she couldn't quite name. Not amusement, more like recognition of an unusual situation that required unusual attention. "Tell me why," he said. So she told him. Not everything, and not elegantly. She explained the dinners, the suitors, the debts, the way her mother spoke about her future, as though Charlotte herself were not in the room. She explained that she had no desire to destroy her life, only to protect it from being destroyed by someone else. She explained that she wanted a legal marriage, a real one, witnessed and documented, so that no one could undo it. She explained that she expected nothing from him afterward except the protection that a surname provided. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked the post back up. "Go home," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon? Go back to wherever you came from. This isn't the solution you're looking for." "With respect," Charlotte said carefully, "I didn't ask for your advice." "No. You asked for my name." He set the post in its hole and reached for the tamping tool. "I'm not interested." Charlotte stood very still. She had anticipated resistance. She had not anticipated this particular quality of resistance. Not outrage, not confusion, not negotiation. Simply a clean refusal, delivered without cruelty or interest. The refusal of a man who had looked at her situation and made a judgment about what she deserved, entirely independent of what she was asking for. She realized, standing in the cold village air, that this was the first time in her memory that a man had refused to engage with her as a category. He had not seen a transaction. He had not seen an asset or a liability. He had looked at her as a person, assessed what was good for that person, and said no. She found it unexpectedly destabilizing and unexpectedly interesting. "Why not?" she asked. He paused. He looked at her again. That same careful, measuring look. "Because you deserve better than a marriage designed to make someone else angry," he said. "Even if the someone else deserves it." Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it, then said, "That's a surprisingly principled position for a man repairing someone else's fence." Something flickered across his face. Not a fence, something quieter. "Go back to your inn," he said. "Think about whether this is actually what you want." She went back to the inn. She thought about it. She thought about him standing at that fence. The refusal that had nothing calculated in it, the judgment that had been entirely about her rather than about himself. She thought about the fact that every man her mother had ever placed across a dinner table from her had wanted something from the interaction. This man had wanted to be left alone to repair a fence. And the following morning, she returned. Because what she had decided, lying awake in the narrow inn bed, was this: a man who refused to take advantage of a vulnerable woman was exactly the kind of man she should be trying to marry. Arthur was clearing debris from the lane beside the church when she found him. He saw her coming and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, exactly, but a recognition that he had perhaps underestimated her. "I thought about it," Charlotte said. "I still want to marry you." He looked at her for a long moment. In that silence, she watched him properly for the first time. Not assessing his usefulness, but actually looking. The way he held himself was not the posture of a man accustomed to labor. It was the posture of a man who had chosen it. The intelligence in his eyes was not concealed so much as quietly set aside. The quality of his voice carried an education that simple farm work did not produce. She filed all of it away without commenting on any of it. Whatever his story was, it was his to share or keep. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure." He looked at the hills for a moment, then back at her. "I have a cottage on the hillside," he said. "It's not large. That's not a problem. I don't have money. Neither do I. And you understand this would be real. Not an arrangement. Not something you undo when the situation changes." Charlotte met his eyes directly. "I understand." A long pause. "All right," he said. "I'll marry you." She had expected to feel triumph. What she felt instead was something far more complicated. Relief and nervousness, and something she couldn't name yet, something that had to do with the weight he had put behind those two words, as though yes was a thing he did not say lightly and intended to mean for a very long time. The marriage was arranged through the village minister 3 days later. It was, Charlotte thought, the first real choice she had ever made. Chapter 3. The proposal no one should have made. Before the wedding, Charlotte spent those 3 days learning the shape of the village. Glenhaven was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and large enough that a newcomer was observed rather than questioned. She walked its lanes, visited its small market, sat at the window of the inn, with tea she made last as long as possible. She watched Arthur. He moved through Glenhaven the way water moves through a familiar landscape, without effort, without announcement. He seemed to know everyone. He helped without being asked. She saw him carry sacks of grain for an elderly shopkeeper who was struggling with her delivery. She saw him sit for nearly half an hour with a child who had fallen and hurt himself, talking to the boy in a low, easy voice until the crying stopped. She saw him give away his own lunch to a young family whose cart had broken down on the road through the village, making his gift look so casual that the family barely registered they had received one. He did none of this while looking to see if anyone was watching. Charlotte was watching. On the evening before the wedding, she found him sitting on a low stone's walls at the edge of the village, looking out at the valley below. She sat beside him without being invited. He didn't seem to mind. They were quiet for a while. "You're not what I expected," she said eventually. "What did you expect?" She considered the honest answer. Someone easier to manage. He didn't smile, but something in his expression relaxed slightly. "And instead, someone with opinions." She paused. "Someone who refused me." "I should have held out longer," he said, and something in his voice was almost dry, almost amused. She looked at him properly. He was looking at the valley, and in the last light of the evening she could see that his face at rest was not a simple face. There were things in it she hadn't been close enough to see before. A quality of patience that didn't come from ease, the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time with their own thoughts and made a careful peace with them. "Why did you agree?" she asked. "You made very good arguments against it." He was quiet for a moment. "Because you helped 3 people in this village on your way to argue with me this morning," he said. "You gave money to the widow on the corner. You carried the baker's daughter's basket when the girl dropped it. You stopped to help someone whose cartwheel was stuck in the mud. And you didn't make it into something grand, you just helped and walked on." He paused. "You thought no one was watching." Charlotte said nothing. "I've spent a long time," he continued, "believing that people who come from wealth are primarily interested in protecting it. You apparently came all this way specifically to throw yours away." He looked at her. "That's unusual. So is a laborer who speaks like he attended university," Charlotte said. Something moved in his expression, brief, contained, like a door being carefully closed. "We all have things we don't discuss," he said. "That seems fair," she said. They sat in the cooling evening air for a while longer without speaking. It was a comfortable silence. She had not expected to be comfortable with this man. She had expected usefulness, not ease. The following morning they stood together in Glenhaven's small grey church. The minister was a round, kind man named Reverend Calloway who asked no difficult questions and seemed genuinely pleased to perform the ceremony. 2 villagers served as witnesses, the blacksmith and his wife, who had apparently known Arthur for several years and regarded Charlotte with a cautious approval that suggested Arthur had earned their trust slowly and kept it carefully. The ceremony lasted 12 minutes. Charlotte said the words clearly without hesitation. "Arthur," said them quietly, looking at her directly in a way that made the simple, ancient phrases feel unexpectedly weighted. When it was done, they walked out of the church together, into gray Scottish morning air, and Charlotte Beaumont became Charlotte Blackwood. She stood on the church steps and thought about her mother reading the letter at Ravenshire Manor. She thought about Edward Ashford and his inheritance, law conversations, and his dead first wife. She thought about the fact that she had just married a stranger. And she felt, with a clarity that surprised her, entirely and completely certain. She wrote a letter to Amelia that afternoon, brief, factual, ending with one sentence. I am well, and I believe I have done the right thing. It was the truest thing she had written in years. Chapter 4. The Marriage of Two. The cottage sat on the hillside above Glenhaven, reached by a path that wound upward through bracken and heather. It was small as he had promised, 2 rooms, a fireplace, a kitchen no larger than a generous wardrobe, a garden that had been recently cleared and looked ready for planting. It was also entirely her own, not in the legal sense, in the practical sense. No servants, no housekeeper, no one to arrange meals or maintain the fire. Everything that needed doing in this house would be done by the 2 people who lived in it. Charlotte had never in her life made her own tea. Arthur watched her standing in the kitchen on the first morning, looking at the range, looking at the rouge, with the expression of someone studying a document written in an unfamiliar language, and said nothing. He simply put the kettle on himself, built up the fire, and then, without making a lesson of it, showed her what he was doing. By the end of the first week, she was making the tea herself. By the end of the second, Smeeford, she could cook 3 things competently and had developed opinions about all 3. They fell into a pattern without discussing it. Arthur worked in the village, on the cottage, on the land around it. Charlotte managed the house, which turned out to involve considerably more actual thinking than she had expected, and considerably less of the elaborate performance that managing Ravenshire Manor's social calendar had required. She found she preferred it. The evenings were theirs. After supper they sat by the fire, and those hours produced the first real conversations of their marriage. Not the careful exchanges of strangers arranging a practical agreement, but the longer, looser conversations of people who are gradually becoming known to each other. He asked about her father. She told him about the Sunday morning walks, the landmarks, the names of the peaks. Her father had spoken to her as though her opinions were worth hearing, even when she was 9 years old, and her opinions were largely about horses. She asked about his travels. He described roads and weather, and the particular quality of silence in remote places, choosing his words carefully. Deliberately careful, she had begun to notice in a specific way. Not the vagueness of someone with nothing to say, the precision of someone editing in real time. He asked what she had actually wanted to do with her life, before her mother turned it into a campaign. No one had ever asked her that before. She thought about it for a long time before answering. I wanted to be useful, she said. Not useful in the way my mother means the word. She means useful as a currency. I mean genuinely useful. The way you are in this village, where people's days are slightly better because you were in them. He looked at her across the firelight. You already are that, he said, simple, unembellished. He didn't retreat from it. Charlotte looked at the fire and said nothing, because saying nothing felt safer than whatever she would have said if she had spoken. 3 weeks into the marriage, she treated his shoulder. He had come home, favoring his left arm and trying not to show it. She noticed within 30 seconds. She told him to sit down. He argued briefly. She ignored the argument, found the small medicine kit she had brought from Ravenshire, and examined the injury. An old wound, she realized immediately. Not recent. Something from years ago that had never healed quite right, had been aggravated by today's work, and had been quietly tolerated for longer than it should have been. "How did this happen?" she asked. "A long time ago," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. She wrapped it carefully, the way her father's physician had taught her when she was 12, and had decided that medicine was more interesting than needlepoint. Arthur watched her work. "You know what you're doing," he said. "I was a curious child. You're a curious adult." She tied off the bandage and sat back. They were very close together in the small kitchen, the light low, the fire warm. "There are things about you that don't fit together," she said. "I know. I'm not going to ask about them." He looked at her steadily. "Why not?" "Because you'll tell me when you're ready. And if you're never ready, that's your right." She began putting the medicine kit away. "I married you because I wanted to make my own choices. I'm not going to immediately start making yours." A pause. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. The weight behind them was not 2 words worth. She felt it settle somewhere she hadn't expected. Somewhere low and quiet. Somewhere that told her this marriage had become something she hadn't planned for when she stood at that window in Ravenshire and decided to burn her future down. She nodded and went back to the medicine kit. But that night, lying awake in the dark, she allowed herself to be honest about what she had felt when he said her name, not the gratitude that she had already understood. The other thing, the thing underneath the gratitude. She had no tidy word for it yet. She filed it carefully away and went to sleep. A month into the marriage, a storm arrived. It descended from the north in the early afternoon. Proper Scottish weather, the kind that turns the sky green before it. It turns it black, that drives horizontal rain against windows, and makes the outdoors genuinely dangerous. Arthur came inside with the storm barely an hour behind him, soaked to the shoulders, and they spent the rest of the day and the entire evening trapped together inside the cottage. It should have been uncomfortable. It was, instead, the best day Charlotte had experienced in 2 years. They talked for hours. They argued about history, specifically about the historical responsibility of wealthy families to the communities around their estates. Their positions were almost perfectly reversed from what she would have expected given their apparent circumstances. He argued that landowners bore a genuine obligation that most of them ignored. She argued that obligation imposed from outside produced nothing real, that it had to come from the individual. They went back and forth for a long time, and Charlotte found herself sharpening her arguments against his the way you sharpen a blade against a whetstone. With pleasure at the resistance, with genuine satisfaction when something held. Arthur was quick, precise. His arguments were structured the way arguments are structured by people who have been trained to think carefully. He knew history she didn't know. He referenced economic theories she had read, but never discussed with anyone, because the people in her mother's dining room didn't discuss economic theories. More than once he caught himself mid-sentence and pulled back, choosing a simpler word, a less specific reference, as though he had nearly revealed something and corrected course. Charlotte pretended not to notice. That night, when the storm had quieted to a persistent heavy rain, she sat by the dying fire, alone after Arthur had gone to bed. She thought about who she had married. Not what she had assumed she was marrying, not the uncomplicated arrangement she had proposed on a cold morning in a village square. She thought about the sharp mind she'd had spent the evening arguing with. The careful kindness she had watched him dispense throughout the village, the way he said her name like it was something he was being careful with. The old wound in his shoulder, the sealed letters that arrived and that he read alone. The way the blacksmith, a practical, skeptical man, treated Arthur with a deference that went slightly beyond ordinary friendship. She was married to someone who was not who he said he was. The question was not whether she would eventually learn the truth. The question was whether the truth would change anything that actually mattered. She sat with that question for a long time and realized, quietly and without drama, that she already suspected the answer was no. Chapter 5. The secret behind the beggar. 6 weeks into their marriage, a messenger arrived at the cottage. Charlotte was in the garden when the horse came up the path. A good horse, well kept, ridden by a young man in plain clothes that were nevertheless of noticeably good quality. He asked for Arthur by a name Charlotte had not heard before. She called Arthur from inside, and when he came to the door, his expression became something she had not seen from him before. Contained, almost still, like a man steadying himself for something that had finally arrived. He spoke with the messenger for less than 5 minutes. He accepted a sealed letter bearing a crest. Charlotte caught only a fragment of before Arthur turned away. The messenger rode back down the hill. Arthur stood outside the cottage for a moment with the letter in his hand, not reading it. His back was to her. She could see the tension across his shoulders. She did not ask, but she noticed, as she had been noticing for weeks, the sealed letters, 3 before this one, all bearing marks that suggested official correspondence. A dispute between 2 farmers in the village. Nappets, the village that the elder had brought to Arthur for a decision, not advice, and both farmers had accepted without argument. Details Arthur knew about a prominent Edinburgh family that went beyond casual knowledge. Structural, specific, the kind of knowledge that came from proximity to power rather than distance from it. The cottage itself, which looked humble and was built to a quality that exceeded its appearance. She turned each of these things over without voicing them, adding them one by one to a picture that was becoming increasingly legible. Then she found the ring. It was a Tuesday morning. She was cleaning the main room while Arthur was in the village. Moving the small wooden chair beside the desk, the chair caught the edge of a shelf, and the shelf's contents shifted, and a small box fell to the floor and came open. Inside it was a signet ring. Charlotte picked it up. It was heavy gold, old, the kind of thing that had been in a family for generations. The crest was engraved clearly, a shield divided into quarters, 2 animals she recognized as Scottish heraldic symbols, and beneath it a name, Blackwood. She stared at it. Her name. Her married name. The name of the man who had told her he was a wandering laborer with a hillside cottage. And nothing to his name, except the worn clothes on his back. She set the ring carefully back in its box. She set the box on the shelf. She moved the chair to where it had been. She sat down at the kitchen table. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. She found that interesting. She was still sitting there when Arthur came home. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her face. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. "You found it," he said. "It fell." He nodded. He came in and sat down across from her. "Tell me," Charlotte said so. He told her. He told her slowly, as though each piece of it cost something to say. His full name was Arthur James Blackwood, the 4th Duke of Blackwood, owner of Blackwood Castle and approximately 140,000 acres of Scottish land, stretching across 3 counties. One of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. He had left it 6 years ago. "My father died when I was 22, he said. "I inherited overnight. And what I found, what I couldn't have understood before it happened, was that the title changed how every person around me saw me. Not slowly, immediately. Friends I had known for years became deferential. Women who had never noticed me were suddenly fascinated. business partners who had been direct became elaborate. Every conversation had a second conversation inside it. He was looking at the table as he spoke, and she could see that this was not a rehearsed explanation. It was the real thing, the actual shape of what had happened to him, being said out loud for perhaps the first time. "I spent 2 years trying to find people who wanted me rather than what I represented," he said. "I couldn't." The title was a lens. It bent everything. Every friendship. Every potential. He stopped. Everything. He had put his steward in charge. A man named Henderson, who had been with the family for 30 years, and who he trusted entirely. He had told a small number of people he needed to be absent for reasons of health. And he had walked away. For 6 years, he had moved from place to place, working with his hands, living simply, finding what he had not been able to find inside Blackwood Castle. The experience of being unknown, of being only what he did and how he treated people, rather than what he owned. He had been in Glenhaven for 8 months when Charlotte arrived. "And me," Charlotte said. "You knew my family name." "I recognized it when you told me," he said. "The Beaumonts of Ravenshire." "Yes." "You didn't say so." "No." "Why not?" He looked at her directly. "Because you were treating me as a person. If I'd told you who I was, everything would have changed. You would have seen the title. And I..." He stopped again. "Then, I didn't want you to." Charlotte sat with that. She went through what she was feeling, in order honestly, the way she had always done when the thing being felt was complicated. Shock. Yes, the picture of the last 2 months was being entirely redrawn. Anger? Yes, and legitimate. He had let her believe something false. The choice of whether the truth changed things had been hers to make, and he had taken it from her. And then, beneath those, something else. She thought about everything she actually knew about this man. Not the title. The man. The fence. The child who was crying. The lunch given away without ceremony. The arguments by the fire. The way he had refused her in that village square. Not because refusing served him, but because he thought she deserved better. None of that was the Duke of Blackwood. All of that was Arthur. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. It wasn't your choice to make. Whether the truth changed things, that was mine to decide." He didn't argue. "You're right. I'm sorry." A long silence settled between them, and it was different from their usual silences. Heavier, not yet resolved. "Is there more?" she asked. He hesitated. "Tell me," she said again. "The letters," he said. "The estates need attention. Henderson is aging. There are decisions I've been making by correspondence that can't continue that way. I'm going to have to go back eventually." Charlotte looked at the table. Going back meant Blackwood Castle. It meant a title. It meant society. It meant the world she had walked away from Ravenshire Manor to escape. Different in its specifics, identical in its architecture. She stood up. She walked to window and looked out at the hillside, the heather, the valley below, the hills she had come to know over 6 weeks of living on their slope. She thought about what she wanted, not what made sense, what she wanted. She turned around. "Are you the same person I married?" she asked. Arthur looked at her without wavering. "Yes, the same man who repaired fences and gave away his lunch and sat with a child who was crying until the child stopped. Yes, the same man who told me to go home because he thought I deserved better than a marriage designed to make someone else angry." A beat. "Yes," he said. "That man has always been me." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "Then we have a great deal to discuss," she said, "about what going back actually means and what role I play in it. And what I expect from a marriage that is apparently somewhat more complicated than I initially contracted for." Something moved in his expression, careful, hoping. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That is me not leaving," she said. "We'll work out what it means from there." Chapter 6. The mother returns. 2 weeks after Arthur's revelation, Victoria Ashworth arrived in Glenhaven. Charlotte heard the carriage before she saw it. The crunch of expensive wheels on the village road, the particular sound of horses that had been well fed and well groomed. She was in the garden when it reached her. She stood up, turned toward the lane, and something in her chest went very still. The carriage stopped at the cottage gate. Victoria descended with the careful dignity of a woman who had spent 40 years for performing composure and had become genuinely excellent at it. She was dressed impeccably, travel clothes but the expensive kind. Behind her, with an expression of practiced neutrality, came Edward Ashford. Charlotte had not expected that. She stood in the garden and watched them come through the gate. Victoria took in the cottage, the garden, the hillside, Charlotte's practical dress and ungloved hands in a single sweeping assessment. Her expression did not change, which meant she was using all of her self-control. "Charlotte," she said. "Mother, you look well." "I am well." Victoria's eyes moved around the property. "Is he here? Your husband?" "I see." A pause. "Charlotte, I want you to understand that I am not here to argue. I'm here because I'm your mother and I was worried about you, and I simply need to see for myself." "You brought Edward Ashford," Charlotte said. Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Edward was kind enough to offer the use of his carriage and his presence. Silence. Edward stepped forward. He had the particular smooth quality of a man who managed difficult situations professionally. The slight tilt of the head, the carefully concerned expression, the voice that seemed reasonable even when it wasn't. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. Your mother has been very worried. We only want to ensure everything's in order." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "Everything is very much in order," she said. "Thank you." She invited them inside because the alternative was a scene in the garden. Victoria sat where she was offered a seat. She accepted tea with a grace that suggested she was used to accepting things she didn't want. Edward, for his part, could not entirely conceal his view of the cottage. The small rooms, the simple furniture, the absolute absence of anything that suggested the life Charlotte had been raised to occupy. "Charlotte," Victoria said at last, both hands wrapped around her cup. "I understand you were upset. I understand the situation at Ravenshire has been difficult. But surely, having had time to reflect actively, you can see that there are better solutions." "I'm not looking for solutions," Charlotte said. "I'm already where I want to be." "You're living in A." Victoria stopped. "A cottage," Charlotte said. "Yes, with a man who has." "My husband," Charlotte said. "Yes." Edward leaned forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, with genuine concern, what do you actually know about this man? His background, his prospects. You married a stranger, a wanderer. That is simply not." The door opened. Arthur came in. He had come straight from the village, which meant he was in his working clothes. The worn jacket, the muddy boots, the hair not particularly arranged. He took in the room in a single glance. Victoria on one chair, Edward on the other, Charlotte standing at the fireplace with her arms folded and her expression carefully even. He came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He simply stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, which was itself a complete sentence. "Mr. Blackwood," Victoria said, with the particular tone of a woman making an effort. "Charlotte has told us very little about you. We thought it was time to make sure the investment is sound," Arthur said. A silence. "I beg your pardon," Victoria said. "I don't mean any offense. I simply want to be precise about what this conversation is." He looked at Edward. "You're here to determine whether Charlotte made an error that can be corrected." Edward's careful neutrality slipped a fraction. "I'm here as a friend of the family." "You're here because you expected to marry her," Arthur said. "Simply, as a fact. That's understandable, but that's not how things have gone." Victoria set down her teacup. When she looked at Charlotte, her expression had moved past performance into something more genuine, and therefore more painful. "Charlotte," she said, "I know you believe I don't care about your happiness, but I am your mother. I have been frightened. The debts, the estate." "I know, Mother," Charlotte said. "Then come home. Let us find a proper—" "I am home," Charlotte said. Victoria flinched. Very small, but Charlotte saw it. "He has nothing," Victoria said quietly. "You gave up everything for a man with nothing." Charlotte looked at her mother and opened her mouth to answer. Before she could, Edward stood up. Whatever calculation had been happening behind his careful expression resolved itself into something less careful and considerably less kind. "You've made a fool of yourself," he said, his eyes moving around the cottage with barely concealed contempt. "Trapping yourself in this. For what? To spite her? You've ruined your reputation, your prospects." "Mr. Ashford," Arthur said, his voice had. It was a small change. Nothing raised, nothing dramatic. But it was the change from a man choosing patience to a man choosing, deliberately, to stop. Every person in the room felt it. Edward stopped speaking. Arthur looked at him with the particular quality of attention of someone who has spent a long time being very careful and has decided that this specific moment no longer calls for it. "You are in my house," Arthur said, addressing my wife. A silence so complete they could hear the fire. "I'd like you to leave now," he said. Edward looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Arthur. And Charlotte watched her mother, in that moment, see for the first time that the man standing beside her daughter was not what he appeared to be. Not the worn jacket, not the muddy boots, something underneath all of that. A quality that Victoria, who had spent a lifetime in rooms full of powerful men, recognized without being able to name. Edward left without further comment. Victoria stood. She looked at Charlotte with an expression Charlotte had never seen on her mother's face before. Uncertain. Small. Very tired. "I just wanted you to be safe," Victoria said. "I know," Charlotte said. "I am safe, Mother. I am genuinely safe." Victoria looked at Arthur once more. Something moved in her expression that might, in a different woman, have been the beginning of understanding. Then she walked to the door. "I'll write," she said. "I'll write back," Charlotte told her. The carriage left. The sound of it faded down the hill and was replaced by the ordinary sounds of the cottage. The fire, the wind against the window, the particular quality of silence that meant they were alone. Charlotte stood in the center of the room for a moment without moving. Arthur was behind her, close, not speaking. "Are you all right?" he asked. Charlotte thought about it honestly. She thought about Mother's face in that last moment, uncertain, tired. More human than Charlotte had seen her look in 2 years. She thought about Edward Ashford and the contempt in his eyes as he looked around the cottage, and how completely indifferent she had felt to that contempt. She thought about Arthur standing beside her, saying nothing more than "You are in my house," and how that had been exactly and precisely enough. "Yes," she said. "Actually, yes." She turned around. He was watching her with the steady attention she had come to know over the past 2 months. The attention that saw more than it declared. "She doesn't know yet," Charlotte said. "About who you are." "No, she will." "Yes." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. She thought about her mother's face when that news eventually arrived. The full realization of what she had dismissed. She searched herself for the satisfaction she might have expected to feel at that prospect. She didn't find it. What she found was considerably simpler. She was standing in a small cottage on a Scottish hillside with a man who had stood beside her without being asked, and she did not want to be anywhere else. "I'm making dinner," she said. "And then we need to finish the conversation we started 2 weeks ago about Blackwood Castle, about what going back actually looks like." "Charlotte," he said. She turned. His expression was open in a way it rarely was, the careful management briefly suspended, something underneath it visible. "I know," she said quietly. "I know what you want to say." "Say it over dinner." She went to the kitchen, and after a moment, she heard him follow. Chapter 7. Half of Scotland. 3 days later, Arthur took Charlotte to see Blackwood Castle for the first time. They rode the better part of a morning, traveling away from Glen Haven into deeper countryside, following roads that grew wider and better maintained as they went. Charlotte noted the improvement without commenting on it. She noticed how the land changed. The fields they passed were large, well-drained, healthy. Stone walls in good repair, farmhouses that were solid and clean. Workers who looked adequately fed and adequately paid. This was not the neglected, struggling countryside she associates with estates run purely for extraction. Someone had invested in this land across years of careful, unglamorous work. She thought about a steward named Henderson, managing all of it alone. She thought about the sealed letters and the careful replies. She thought about a man arguing by firelight that landowners bore obligations, most of them ignored. Then Blackwood Castle came into view around a bend in the road, and all of her quiet thoughts went still. It was not what the word castle usually brought to mind. Not a ruin, not a fortress. It was a great house in the Scottish tradition, built in pale stone, 4 stories, towers at 2 corners, rows of tall windows that caught the morning light and returned it in warm gold that made the whole structure look almost alive. Behind it, the hills rose steeply, covered in heather that was just beginning to show its autumn color. Before it, a long avenue of trees led from the main gate to the entrance. It was one of the most beautiful things Charlotte had ever seen. She didn't say that. What she said was, "It needs the east tower window repaired." Arthur looked at her. "3rd floor, 2nd window from the right," she said. "The frame's warped. You can see the gap from here." Something that might have been a smile moved across his face and was quickly managed. Henderson met them at the door. A small, precise man in his 60s, white-haired, with the expression of someone who concealed everything except competence. He looked at Arthur with the careful relief of a man who had been managing too much alone for too long. He looked at Charlotte with the assessing thoroughness of someone trying to determine, quickly and accurately, whether she was genuine. Charlotte looked back at him steadily. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, as though something had been established. He showed them through the house. It was large in a way that took time to understand, not merely big, but deep. Room after room opening into further rooms, corridors connecting wings, a library that occupied most of 1 floor, a kitchen that could have housed Charlotte's cottage several times over. Estates de the treat, much of it needed the attention of someone who actually lived in it, who made decisions about how rooms should function and what they should serve. Charlotte walked through, with the part of her mind that had managed Ravenshire's affairs running quietly in the background, noting what worked, what didn't, what could be changed, what was worth preserving. She couldn't help it. It was how she thought. Arthur walked beside her. They were alone by the time they reached the library. Henderson had tactfully found reasons to be elsewhere. Charlotte stood at a window that looked out over the eastern hills and sat with everything she was looking at. Tell me what you're thinking, Arthur said. She turned around. He was standing a few feet away, watching her with the attention she had come to know. He looked, she thought, both more himself here and less comfortable, as though this space belonged to him in a way that cost him something even now. I'm thinking, she said, that this is the life you ran away from. Yes, and that the reasons you ran were real, and that the reasons you stayed away were also real. He said nothing. And I'm thinking, she said, that a house this size, run by someone who actually cared about more than appearances, could do a great deal of good. The right programs, the right priorities. Arthur looked at her. I was suggesting myself, she said. A pause. I know, he said. Is that something you'd consider? I would consider anything, he said. That involves you staying. Charlotte looked at him. She had been carrying something for weeks, since the night by the fire when he had said her name like it was worth being careful with. Since the storm evening when she had realized she was enjoying herself more than she could remember. Enjoying almost anything since the morning she had sat at the kitchen table and understood, before he had finished his first sentence, that she was not going to leave. She had been carrying it and not looking at it directly. The way you don't look directly at the sun. Arthur, she said. Charlotte, I need to say something true. All right. I married you despite my mother, she said. That was the entire reason. I wasn't running toward you. I was running away from something else, and you were where I stopped running. He didn't flinch. He waited. And somewhere in the last 2 months, Charlotte said, that stopped being true. I don't know exactly when, but I know that I'm not staying because of what this house is, or what your title means, or what society will say when the news gets out. I'm staying because I can't imagine being anywhere that you aren't. She paused. That's the true thing. Arthur crossed the distance between them. He had not touched her, not properly, in all the weeks of their marriage. They had built something real in that time, but carefully, with a great deal of space between them. Both of them carrying old wounds that required that space. He took her hand. Both of his around one of hers. I thought no one could ever see me past the title, he said. I'd spent long enough believing it that I'd stopped looking. And then, a woman walked up to me in a village square and proposed marriage on the grounds that I looked poor, and I was so thoroughly unprepared for it that I did the only thing I could think of, which was refuse her. Charlotte almost smiled. And then she came back, he said. And I watched her be kind to 3 people on her way to argue with me. Without noticing anyone was watching, without making anything of it. And I thought, this is who she actually is. Not what the situation requires. Not what anyone is watching for. Just who she is. His hand tightened slightly around hers. I didn't accept because the arrangement was convenient. I accepted because I wanted to know you. And now you do, Charlotte said. And now I do, he said. And I would like to keep knowing you for considerably longer than 2 months. Charlotte looked at their hands. She thought about the window at Ravenshire Manor, pressing her palm against cold glass, watching dark hills, feeling her own future pressing back. She thought about everything she had done since that moment. The reckless decision, the cold morning, the village square, the strange quiet weeks on a hillside learning what a life she had chosen actually felt like. She had been trying to protect herself. She had accidentally found someone who wanted to face the world with her, alongside her as an equal. I'd like that as well, she said. Outside the library window, the Scottish Highlands stretched away under an autumn sky. Pale gold, wide, impossibly open. They stood together looking at it. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing left to say that needed words. In the months that followed, Blackwood Castle became something it had not been in years. Henderson noticed it first, as Henderson noticed most things, in the way the rooms began to feel occupied rather than merely maintained. The East Wing, which had stood empty, was converted at Charlotte's direction into a community resource. A reading room stocked with duplicates from the library, a small clinic staffed twice weekly by a physician from the nearest town, meeting space available to any organization in the surrounding valleys that needed it. The farms on the estate were reviewed. Tenants whose arrangements were genuinely unfair found their terms renegotiated. Land that had been struggling because of outdated drainage began to be improved. These were not grand gestures. They were the ordinary work of someone paying attention, done without announcement, done because the need was there. Henderson, who had managed everything alone through 6 difficult years, began taking afternoons off for the first time in a decade. He told the head housekeeper that the new Duchess understood estate accounts better than most men he had worked with. The head housekeeper said that did not surprise her. Amelia Fairchild's letter arrived in the second month after they returned to the castle. It was brief. It contained one line that Charlotte read 3 times. "I told you he was worth it." Charlotte wrote back a letter several pages long. Victoria Ashworth came once in the early spring. She came alone. No Edward Ashford. She arrived in her own conveyance and stood in the entrance hall of Blackwood Castle, and was quiet for a long moment. Charlotte received her in the library. Victoria sat very straight and looked at the room, and then at her daughter, and the expression on her face moved through several things before it settled. "I owe you an apology," she said. Charlotte waited. "I treated you as a solution rather than a daughter," Victoria said. "I knew it at the time. I told myself it was necessary, and I was wrong." She paused. "Your father would not have recognized what I became after he died." Charlotte thought about Sunday morning walks and the names of peaks. "He would have understood," she said. "He would have been frightened too." Victoria looked at her for a moment. "You're more like him than you know," she said. Something settled in Charlotte's chest at that. Quietly, permanently, they had tea. They talked carefully, the way people talk when they are beginning to rebuild something from a foundation that had been poorly laid to begin with. It was not easy. It was not what Charlotte had imagined family feeling like when she was a child. But it was real. When Victoria left, she embraced Charlotte at the door. Briefly, somewhat stiffly. The embrace of a woman remembering how. Charlotte held on slightly longer. Arthur resumed his title without the weight that had driven him from it. The difference, Charlotte thought, was that he chose it now. 6 years ago, he had inherited it surrounded by people who wanted what it represented. He returned to it knowing what he wanted it to mean. And with someone beside him who asked him the same uncomfortable questions he asked himself, who argued with him by firelight without either of them needing to win, who walked through every room of Blackwood Castle, with her mind running on what was useful and what needed to change. He had stopped hiding the ring. She had found it on the desk one morning, set out plainly, no longer in its box. She hadn't said anything about it. She hadn't needed to. One morning in late October, Charlotte was on the terrace reviewing plans she and Henderson had developed for its second clinic day in the valley. The morning was cold and brilliant, the kind of autumn day that makes Scotland look like an argument. That beauty has definitively won. Arthur came out and stood beside her. He looked at the plans. "You've added a second clinic day," he said. "The one day isn't sufficient," the physician agrees. "Henderson will say the budget." "I've already spoken to Henderson." "The budget is fine if we defer the west fence until spring. A pause. The west fence needs to be done before the snow, he said. The west fence was assessed last week by the blacksmith's son, who is a better fencer than anyone on the estate staff, and who told me it can absolutely wait until March. Another pause. When did you have time to? Tuesday, Charlotte said, while you were in Edinburgh. Silence. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression she had catalogued over the past year. The one that still surfaced sometimes, not as often as it used to. The one that meant he was still, occasionally, surprised to find himself here, in this life, with her. She held his gaze. The clinic day stands, she said. The clinic day stands, he agreed. The plans went back on the table. The hills stretched away in every direction, wide and pale, and belonging to no one who hadn't earned them. Charlotte Blackwood, Duchess of Blackwood, who had once stood at a window in Ravenshire Manor and decided to burn her future down to protect it, stood on the terrace of her own house and felt something she had not reliably felt in years. Not pride, not triumph, only the particular, quiet certainty of a person who chose their life and found it, improbably, to be exactly right. The man standing beside her had made the same choice. They had each run from the lives other people had designed for them, moving in opposite directions, and had somehow ended up in the same place, not because fate arranged it, because they had each, at the moment that counted, chosen the harder thing. And that is where we leave Charlotte and Arthur. If this story stayed with you, if Charlotte's courage meant something to you, or Arthur's patience moved you, please leave a like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love stories like this one. And if you answered my question at the beginning, stay or walk away, go back and check the comments. You might be surprised how many people feel exactly the way you do. Subscribe if you haven't already. New stories go up regularly, and every single one is told with the same care as this one. Thank you for being here today. Until next time.